In Module 12, I'll be covering the related topics of stress, health, and well-being. What is stress? It's something we've all experienced at one point or another, but how do researchers define it? Rather than thinking about stress as simply being a kind of emotional or mental state, instead, it's helpful to think about stress as being a process that involves not only our emotions, but also our cognitions, that is, our thoughts or interpretations of the situation, our body's physical reactions, and our behavioral responses, that is, how we choose to cope with a stressful event. We'll talk about each of these components throughout the next two videos, but for now, let's start with the beginning of the process itself, stressors. The stress process is initiated when we encounter a stressor, that is, a situation or event that we perceive as threatening or challenging. There are various kinds of stressors we might encounter on a daily basis, and they can differ in a number of important ways. First, researchers generally distinguish between stressors that are chronic versus acute. Chronic stressors are ongoing and long-lasting, such as being a caregiver for an elderly person with dementia or experiencing long-term unemployment. Acute stressors, on the other hand, involve brief focal events, such as moving, taking a test, or getting into an argument. An important point here is that even though acute stressors are generally shorter-lived, they can still have long-lasting effects. For example, falling and breaking your leg is another example of an acute stressor, but the person may continue to experience long-lasting effects from the injury. Stressors can also be more or less severe. On the low extreme, daily hassles are the minor irritations and annoyances that are part of our everyday lives, such as getting stuck in traffic, losing your wallet, or getting into minor arguments with friends and family. However, even though daily hassles might be perceived as being relatively small, they can add up and take a toll on us both physically and emotionally. In fact, some research has found that the frequency of daily hassles might be more strongly associated with physical health problems than more major life events. On the other end of the spectrum, traumatic events involve exposure to actual or threatened death or serious injury. This might include things like exposure to military combat, threatened or actual physical assaults, natural disasters, and serious vehicle accidents. In between daily hassles and traumatic events are major life change events. These are the kinds of things that don't quite rise to the level of trauma, but are still experienced as more serious and intense than the minor hassles we encounter on a routine basis. Life change events can also be both positive and negative. Examples of more negative life change events might include things like the death of a loved one, losing a job, or getting a divorce. Examples of more positive life change events, on the other hand, might include things like starting a new job, moving to a new city, getting married, having children, etc. This brings up another important point about stress. Not all stress is necessarily bad. In fact, some amount of stress appears to be beneficial for optimal performance on challenging tasks. For example, this is the famous Eustress curve, showing the relationship between stress and performance. And here, performance could be for any kind of task, such as taking an exam, giving a speech, or playing in a sporting event. As you can see, the relationship between stress and performance is not a straight line. Rather, it forms what we call a curvilinear relationship. This means that as stress levels increase from low to moderate to high, the underlying relationship between stress and performance changes. At first, there appears to be a positive relationship between stress and performance. When we're not stressed at all, that is, when we're bored or disinterested, we don't tend to perform very well on any kind of task. So having a little bit of stress can actually be a good thing, at least initially. Feeling a little amped up can prepare our bodies for action and help us to perform our best. Researchers call this good kind of stress eustress. At some point, however, stress is no longer helpful for performance. Think of taking an exam or giving a speech and becoming so overwhelmed with anxiety that you actually begin to choke. When stress exceeds this optimal level, it becomes excessive and debilitating, what researchers call distress. So we've talked about the beginning of the stress process, that is, the different kinds of stressors we might encounter. After we encounter a stressor, this starts a cascade of physical, cognitive, and behavioral responses. Let's first talk about the physical part of this process. What happens in our bodies when we encounter a stressful situation? Our body's physical response to stressors is primarily controlled by two systems, the sympathetic nervous system and the hypothalamus-pituitary-adrenal axis. that last one's quite a mouthful, so researchers usually abbreviate it as the HPA axis. First, recall from Module 3.2 that the sympathetic nervous system is part of your autonomic nervous system, which controls your involuntary bodily functions, such as breathing, heart rate, and digestion. Activation of the sympathetic nervous system triggers the release of adrenaline from the adrenal glands, which are located on the top of your kidneys. This works very quickly to initiate a number of bodily responses collectively known as your fight or flight response. These responses are meant to help prepare your body for action, like pupil dilation so you can see better, increased heart rate and breathing, and slowed digestion. At the same time, the HPA axis also becomes active, although it works more slowly than your fight or flight response. Specifically, the hypothalamus begins to release a hormone called the corticotropin-releasing factor, or CRH, which then causes the pituitary gland to release a different hormone called the adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. ACTH then triggers the adrenal glands to release a number of different hormones, including cortisol. Cortisol is a hormone that plays many important functions in your body, including regulating your metabolism, blood sugar, and blood pressure. During times of stress, cortisol triggers the release of glucose, giving your body a short burst of energy. It also suppresses inflammation, which can benefit your immune system. And in the short term, this is a really good thing. It gives your body the energy that you need in order to deal with a stressful situation. For example, if you happen to see a bear in the woods, you want to have the energy to run away if you need to. However, over the long term, elevated cortisol levels can be very damaging for our bodies. For example, if you consistently have high cortisol levels, your body can actually get used to having too much cortisol in your blood, and in turn, this can lead to increased inflammation and a weakened immune system. In fact, in one particularly interesting study, researchers actually exposed healthy participants to nasal drops containing the cold virus. Yes, the participants were fully aware of this and still agreed to participate in the study. They were paid a lot of money for their trouble. The researchers found that participants who reported experiencing higher levels of chronic stress, especially involving difficulties with work or relationships, were more likely to go on to develop a cold, as you can see here in this graph. I feel like I can relate to this a little bit, as I often tend to get a cold right around the end of the semester. Prolonged stress can also be detrimental for your cardiovascular system. A number of studies have found that exposure to stressors such as job strain and marital conflict is associated with a number of cardiovascular problems, including hypertension, that is, high blood pressure. In fact, even doing a relatively short but stressful task in the lab, such as giving a speech or performing mental arithmetic under time pressure, has been shown to elevate people's blood pressure. In turn, we know that high blood pressure can place you at higher risk for other cardiovascular problems, such as a heart attack or stroke. If you feel like you experience a lot of stress in your life, you might find all this to be a little, disheartening to say the least. Does feeling stressed out inevitably mean that you'll end up with worse health outcomes? Well, it turns out maybe not. Regardless of your circumstances, there are things anyone can do to minimize the negative effects of stress, and we'll talk more about some of these strategies in the next video. I'd also highly encourage you to watch the TED Talk, How to Make Stress Your Friend, which is in the supplemental video section on Canvas. In this video, I discussed the process of stress and the physical effects that it can have. For the exam, you should be able to define stress and explain stress as a process, define stressor and distinguish between the different types of stressors, that is, chronic versus acute, and daily hassles versus life changes versus traumatic events. Define and distinguish between eustress and distress. Explain our body's physical response to stress, including both the activation of the sympathetic nervous system and the HPA axis. And finally, discuss the short and long-term effects of elevated cortisol levels.